Hello everyone. So today we're going to present about ethics, made by me, Tom, and Irene. Now we're going to guide you through our real life situation. So first of all, Frances English, a 55-year-old mother who killed her own son, who is 22 at that time, over the shot of a heroin in his blood. So according to Francis, she wishes to end his son's living hell after he suffered a severe head injury after falling off an ambulance while moving very fast. Uh, and the result is that him getting into a really severe coma. Francis was sentenced to 9 years in prison for her actions. In the court, the judge told the jurors that no one has the right to take the law into their own hands. It was also mentioned that no emotions should be taken into consideration when evaluating the case.
Now we're gonna walk you through our knowledge question extraction, and through the real life situation, we can see that the mother's actions were solely motivated through her emotions and personal intuition. The mother's emotions was the love that she had for her son and her wish to end his suffering. The mother's intuition was the belief that her decision to take matters into her own hands was the right thing to do. This is what led to the course of action that she took, which was to take her own son's life with the belief that it was the right thing to do for him. The real life situation can be summarized as a person taking another's life through the drive of love. Therefore, it falls into the knowledge area of ethics. And ethics can be loosely defined as the moral principles that guide one's behavior and actions. Since this topic falls into the category of ethics, arguments can be made regarding the mother's actions and decision to kill her son. The argument up for discussion is when can the mother's action be justified through her emotions and intuition. The knowers need to be taken into consideration for this discussion and real life situation will be the mother and law enforcement, basically. Which leads us to our knowledge question, and that is, under what circumstances can emotion and intuition be used to justify knowledge within the ethics? And here are some vocabularies and terms you guys need to get started. First is ethics, which is the study of morals. Emotion, which is a chain of feelings and complex state of mind that can cause temporary or permanent physical or mental change. Emotion is what's sometimes used to justify certain actions and beliefs. Intuition is the ability to understand without the help of conscious reasoning. Morals, which are concerned with the principles of right and wrong behavior, as well as the goods and bads of human characteristics. Deontological reasoning, an ethical theory that determines the right or wrongness of an act based on the actions over the ending results. Kant's principle is a principle by the philosopher named Kant that puts emphasis on one's duty and role to determine the ethicality of an act. This principle is closely tied to deontological reasoning. And the last is teleological reasoning, an ethical theory that determines the right or wrongness of an act based on the end results over the initial actions it took to get there.
So now we're going to cover the perspectives while evaluating this event. So there are two perspectives that we're going to look at, which one of them is deontological reasoning. It associates with Kant principle, and the other one is teleological reasoning. And these two perspectives can be used to further support the argument on both ends. Deontological reasoning, as mentioned before, is an ethical theory that determines the right or wrongness of an act based on the actions over the ending results. It is usually associated with Kant principle, a principle by a philosopher named Kant that puts emphasis on one's duty and role to determine the ethicality of an act. This principle is closely tied to deontological reasoning. The second perspective is teleological reasoning, which is an ethical theory that determines the right or wrongness of an act based on the end results over the initial actions it took to get there. So for deontological reasoning, the main factors we need to take into account are the mother emotions regarding the situation and and her decision on her actions itself, which can also be called her intuition. Since deontological reasoning focuses on the consequences of an act itself to determine morality, then the mother's emotions and intuition here cannot be used as justification within the ethics due to it completely going against common moral standards. What this means is that her emotions over her son's suffering became a motivation that led to her decision based on personal intuition to end his life. This makes it explicitly clear that her emotions and intuition are what led to the unethical and immoral act that she committed. If we connect this further towards Kant's principle, which places an emphasis on one's duty and role to determine ethicality, then emotions and intuition here becomes less of a justification due to the mother going against her role and duty to protect her child, but instead, her uncontrollable emotions and irrational intuition led to his death instead. And to summarize this point, it was both her emotions and intuition that contributed to the act of her killing her son in the first place, which is already considered unethical and immoral. Not to mention her going against her role and duty as a mother, which is to protect and care for her child despite the situation. And in conclusion, based on the principles of deontological reasoning, these factors identify as actions that contributed to the resulting consequences and therefore cannot be used as justification within the ethics. As for teleological reasoning, which focuses on the maximum benefit that the outcome brings to determine the morality of an act, then the mother's emotions and intuition here is also negated and cannot be used as justification. The reason for this is that the cost and the benefit system doesn't take into consideration, doesn't take the mother emotions and intuition into account as it prioritizes the benefit of the majority rather than one individual. Based on the real life situation, the mother emotions, which is her love for her son, led to her decision, which was intuition-based, to kill him. Through the cost and benefit system, then the cost in this situation would be her son's life. And the only benefits it would bring is the mother's satisfaction and relief over her son's end in suffering. However, despite the benefits it may bring to her individually, her emotions and intuition has led to an upset within the majority, which also includes the law. The fact that she conducted an unethical act that goes against the common moral standards held strongly by the majority of society still hasn't changed. In this situation, the cost outweighs the benefit of the situation, rendering her emotion and intuition rather useless as justifications within the ethics.
And now we'll talk about our counter arguments for the situation. So far for both arguments and perspectives, the implication here being made is that emotion and intuition cannot be used as a justification within the ethics. However, a possible counterclaim for this is that by including the additional use of other ways of knowing, then we can make these two previous already existing factors eligible for use as justification within the ethics that would satisfy both the deontological and teleological reasoning. One of the first other real-life situations we can use as an example is the 1945 bombing on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan by the US government during World War II. This is an event where the US government decided to unleash their nuclear power arsenal in an attempt that would eventually be successful to end the Second World War. Before the drop, US government officials faced a debate on whether the decision to use nuclear weaponry is ethical and necessary due to there being another possible alternate solution to end the war, and that was that the Nazi already surrendered. Despite the debate, the bombs were dropped, and creating catastrophic effects on the Japanese population. However, justification for this case were made by the US government, and it was speculated that the bombing did not occur and American forces were to invade the Japanese mainland. The casualty for both sides would have likely exceeded that caused by the bombing, so speculations also noted that this course of action has saved millions of lives. Based on this upper left situation, we can infer that there was clear use of reasoning that assisted the officials with their decision, which also harbored some emotional connections and intuitive thinking. For deontological reasoning, the actions usually outweighs the results when used to determine morality. When taking Kant's principle into account, the act of killing a large portion of the Japanese population is cancelled out due to the reason that the US government is only simply trying to fulfill their role and duty to preserve their nation. Back in the initial debate on whether they should allow the act or not, it can be safely implied that there were emotions taken into account, since killing is a rather heavy subject and responsibility for one to take. And the intuition here is their decision to initiate the bombing. However, unlike our initial real-life situation, the presence of reasoning here played a big part in the decision or action. Based on this principle, and the conflict between duty and action from Kant's principle through the effects of reasoning, we can decide to conclude that this act can be justified within the ethics through emotion and intuition, with the assistance of reasoning, as the act of killing and staying true to one's duty cancels out each other. And based on teleological reasoning, this course of action carried out by the US government is completely justifiable. Teleological reasoning determines morality based on the consequences of an act, and we can see again that through the process of reasoning, it assisted the US officials into the correct course of action that satisfies this specific moral theory, completely despite the presence of emotional and intuitive factors mentioned earlier. Through the cost and benefit system, we can see that the benefits outweigh the cost by a reasonable amount. The cost being death of a certain number of people within the Japanese mainland, while the benefits lie within the end of the Second World War and more potential deaths for both sides being avoided. Through the process of reasoning, which assisted emotional and intuitive factors for the officials to reach the decision, here, emotions and intuition led by reasoning can be used as justification for unethical conduct within the ethics through teleological reasoning.
So during our progress of analysis about how emotion and intuition can completely used to justify the act of making ethical decisions, we have came up with these resultant questions that we believe should be taken into an account. The first question is, to what extent are ethical verdicts realistic? Can someone make, the second question is, can someone make an emotional decision? If can, how and when can someone make the decisions? And should ethical decisions be the same for everyone, or are there exceptions? If so, how can we justify the exceptions? It leads us to another real-life situation, which is about the Vietnamese government decisions to make citizens over 18-year-old to complete their military service before being allowed to attend college or university. Curriculum number 30, jointly issued by the Ministry of Education and Training and the Ministry of National Defense, request that all married citizens have to delay their education to serve the army, even if they have received an acceptance letter from higher educational institutions but have not actually started their courses. According to the military law, teenagers will undergo military service for at least 18 months instead, regardless of their ethnic origins, professions, or areas of residency. As we know, vertical ethics mostly don't take emotion into consideration. For example, teleological reasoning doesn't take individual feelings when making a cost-benefit argument about ethical decisions. The cost of these ethical decisions would be the family facing potential risk of losing their own child. But then the benefits includes an increase of Vietnam's military force for a purpose of defending the country from any potential threats. Other benefits would be for Vietnam to be able to move up the strength ladder within the United Nations. As you can see, through this cost and benefit analysis, No emotions were taken into account in these situations. When we look at the reality, is it possible to act like how these verdicts have shown? How can a verdict score a perfect value of predicting how a certain action works? This method depends on the consequences of the actions, but us as humans have limits of knowledge about the past, the present, and the future, meaning that we are unable to determine whether or predict the consequences are 100% accurate. Does this mean that ethical verdicts are correct if we, as humans, doesn't take human emotion into as a factor? A way to justify this is when human doesn't have emotions, they will work like robots in a chains of commands. So that leads us to our second question: is that can someone make an emotional decisions? If can, how and when can someone make these decisions? One of the ways we can answer this question is when a different factors overshadows an emotional factors when making our decisions. Tying back to the atomic bomb of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the U.S. used various ways of knowing to justify their inhumane acts. One of them includes that it would prevent further casualties for the U.S. and the Japanese. The factor that overshadows emotions is the benefits of the war, and for the sake of ending the suffering of millions of soldiers in the battlefield, that is when the U.S. government thinks that for the better good, they are willing to take responsibility for 1 million people rather than just stand there and watch the world and it slowly just collide day by day. When using these reasons as justifications, we can understand that the US government follows this format of the case and benefit system, as we know that is theological reasoning. By using this way of reasoning, which itself doesn't take human emotion into considerations, like I said before, the US government can easily get rid of the emotion factors and be able to make the emotional decisions. But why do the US government make the action towards the Japanese civilians when clearly the target is to aim at the Japanese officials? Does the Japanese citizens deserve to receive these consequences? This explains our third resulting questions. Should ethical decisions be the same for everyone, or are there exceptions? If so, how can we justify the exceptions? Well, to answer these questions, let's take a step back and look at the military real situations. If we use ethical reasoning, then there are no exceptions for everyone because the ontological point of view is very impersonal. But if we take emotions into considerations, then there are some exceptions that we can justify. For example, some family may only have their son as to rely on them for financial support, but government law unconditionally just took the child away for the sole purpose of strengthening the nations. Within the families and kids that doesn't graduate high school due to inefficient financial support, those families can only rely on the child to do work and labor to make money, and in a purpose of sustaining their everyday life. Another evidence to prove that it is in the high class families, like successful businessmen, if the son of their family is the only son that can sustain their business and the successors, then taking away the son with a potential of the son is not coming back, it will affect the family business and therefore directly affecting the country's economy if the company is a successful company. In addition, if the son's left, then what would the mom feel when she's alone for 18 months? Would she feel lonely? Why wouldn't the government just take some exceptions because of that? When justifying these emotions that we have when analyzing these ethical decisions, some circumstances can be taken as an exceptions.
Now we're tying back to the original RLS, realizing the real life situation. So tying back to our original real life situation, we're confident to say that Frances' decision to end her son's life is unethical when considering about the moral standards and the way that we commonly use to justify her act, which is considered invalid. However, we also understand that moral decisions are complex, and the instinctive side of humans must be considered as well as the rational side. Maybe everyone has to decide carefully what they want to do when they are presented with a conflict, and consider the situation from multiple perspectives. In addition, how they are going to justify through their way of gaining knowledge, which leads to our point is that a world where freedom exists is where people have different choices and they have the right to make that choice whether it is ethical or not.
So we come to the conclusion that in conclusion, using ethical perspectives, human emotions, history to analysis how unethical decisions are made, we come into the conclusion that emotions and intuition themselves cannot be used to justify unethical acts. However, by cooperating reasoning to analyze the unethical acts, emotions and intuition can definitely be justified in a way of aiming further rather than just emotions. So what have we learned? We have learned about how there are some ways of knowing that is incapable of vindicate acts that went against moral standards. In addition, we learned about how sometimes one doesn't simply make an ethical act purely based on ethical predictions, because we as moral have feelings. And we are still confused about how reasoning must be a go-to way to justify unethical acts. And we want to learn more about the other ways to give explanations for an action that went against the ethics, as well as is there more than two perspectives that we can take into consideration when answering this knowledge question. So here's our side.
Thank you for listening.